what I'd like to do is spend probably 10 or 15 minutes going through a few slides. And if you've seen my talks before, or even maybe watch some of the videos on YouTube, I hope it's not too boring, but just so we're all kind of on the same page to start with. And what I then do is just turn off the slides, and then I'll walk around, and I want to basically have a dialogue with the audience. And the neat thing about that is there are some people who have questions, and they're not quite sure they want to ask them, and there are other people who are bold and ask the same question. And so there's really a lot of overlap across people's interests, and that's why I think the dialogue helps a whole lot. So just to start out, I will tell you that I sometimes jokingly, only half jokingly say that I'm a recovering academic. I used to be a professor of medicine, so when I used to be, it says emeritus, and in my mid-50s, I got so frustrated with trying to do research and teach on this topic in academic medicine, because it really, at least in my neck of the woods, a decade or so ago, it still wasn't something that was very acceptable. So I quit and moved off and worked in biotech startups for a while. And then a guy named Jeff Volek, a young, bright guy, came along and said, Steve, I read your papers, and you really got to get back to this because this is really important. So Jeff sort of picked me up and dusted me off, and we wrote the books, and he and his team have done some absolutely brilliant research, including a paper that just came out this last Saturday that is adding new evidence to this whole debate about saturated fat, and the fact that if you eat saturated fat in the context of a healthy diet, that is limiting sugars and refined carbs, it's definitely not toxic and not dangerous. But we won't get into that today. Just saying that Jeff has really kind of dragged me back out of kind of my own self-imposed exile. And so that's why I'm here tonight. I'll also mention that Jeff and I together have started a company to develop what we have in our books into a coherent program that we will offer to healthcare providers, hospitals, self-insured industry, and things like that, because we're facing an epidemic of diabetes, and if we don't figure a way to reverse this epidemic, it's going to basically bankrupt our healthcare systems, whether it's here in Australia, the United States, or in any other advanced country. The really frightening statistic that just came out last year is that in China, they just did a survey last year, the way only the Chinese can do, just systematically across the whole country, and determined to their horror that 11% of Chinese are type 2 diabetics. And in the United States, we think it's 9%, it's probably a little higher. But 11% in a country the size of China, you can do the math. It's well over 1.3 million, I'm sorry, 130 million people in China. We have to come up with a method to reverse this. So we started a startup company. We've got some initial funding. It's technically a for-profit company. Our goal is to develop something which we can not just prove works, but essentially we figure within 5 years we're going to be giving it away because it's going to be necessary. So what I want to talk about initially is this process of understanding what the optimum low carbohydrate diet looks like. And I put up this picture because this is a photograph. We think it was taken around 1910. It was taken in northern Canada on the Arctic coast. And this is, there's a guy in the background, but there are two women here. And I will tell you that either one of these women knows much more about the practical aspects of a ketogenic diet, much more about it than I do. Because they this group of Inuit had lived in the Arctic for fully 3,000 years. Now, they lived in a place with a very hostile environment, and yet they were able to get enough food to feed their families, and we know that some of them lived to be 70 or 80 years old, so it wasn't a death-dealing diet. People say, oh yeah, they ate beaten fat, but they all died young. No, they were Stone Age people. They lived in a hostile environment, and yet their diet allowed them to sustain their culture for over 3,000 years. And they knew what to feed their children, and their grandparents knew what to feed their grandchildren. But unfortunately, they did not write it down. They weren't literate people, and so we don't know what it was because my ancestors came to North America and told them they were wrong. Anyway, I won't get into that. Interestingly, there were some European origin, Caucasian people who traveled among the Inuit, and I think this is interesting because the Inuit guy here is talking, and the white guys are writing it down. Usually it went the other way around. So this is a painting that came from a Arctic expedition led by a guy named Dr. Frederick Swatka. And he traveled into the Canadian Arctic between 1878 and 1880 because he wanted to find the logbooks of a Royal Navy expedition that went missing in the Arctic trying to find the Northwest Passage. So these two ships and 129 men sailed into the Canadian Arctic in 1844. They were last seen in 1844, and they were never seen alive again. Even into in 1878, they still hadn't found out what precisely happened to this expedition and why they all died. So this guy was going there to look for this. And other expeditions had gone into the Arctic. There were many people who died trying to find out what happened to these guys who died. And the problem with the previous expeditions is they had tried to take all their food with them. And if you try to take all your food for a year with you, that's a big pile of food. And so this guy said, well, these people know how to live in this place. So if we can live on their diet, we can go where they go, eating what they eat, and we'll just have them guide us. So Swatka, and there's another European origin guy here in this diagram, but there were 4 European origin guys, 2 Inuit families. They left the west coast of Hudson Bay in, I think it was December of 1878. So they left in early winter and were gone for 14 months, traveled 3,000 miles overland, and everybody came back alive. They did find a lot of artifacts. They found skeletons. They found boats, the smaller boats that had been beached on the shore, but they did not get the logbooks from the ship, and they didn't find anybody alive. But what was interesting is something he wrote down, Swatka wrote down in his diary, kind of resonated with me 100 years later. So he wrote down in 1880 that when first thrown wholly upon a diet of reindeer meat, it seems inadequate to properly nourish the system, and there is an apparent weakness and inability to perform severe exertive journeys. And then what I highlighted here, but this soon passes away in the course of 2 to 3 weeks. Now the reason this resonated with me is I read this diary, I stumbled on this diary just by chance while I was writing up my PhD dissertation. So I'd spent 3 years studying athletes on low-carb diets. And that's what we figured out, that it took at least 2 or 3 weeks for people to get through this sag before their performance came back. And that was my brand new, never before discovered observation. This guy scooped me by 100 years. What he didn't write down was how much meat and how much fat. Was it high protein, low fat? Was it moderate protein, moderate fat? I mean, what did these people eat? And unfortunately, he didn't write that down. He was a US Army surgeon. He wasn't a nutritionist. We can't blame him for that. Were there other people? People say, well, the Inuit were just a really strange people, and there was nothing else in the Arctic to eat, so they had to eat meat and fat. Well, I also looked around to see if are there other people who lived on a diet that consisted of meat and fat without much carbohydrate or with very little carbohydrate. And this is a relatively modern photograph taken from the Great Rift Valley in Tanzania. And these are Masai warrior males. And you can see they're either really, really skinny or they're really, really tall. And actually, they're both skinny and tall. And these people were not farmers. These were nomadic herders. So the spears they carried wasn't for killing food. The spears they carried were for killing the big cats that were trying to kill their cattle. But they lived on, they had both goats and cows. And they lived on meat, milk, and it sounds yucky to us, but blood. And there's a reason why they had blood in their diet, and that is before they had contact with Europeans who brought them crystalline salt, their only concentrated source of salt was blood. And if you chase after a big cat that's trying to kill your cattle and you sweat a lot, you're going to lose a lot of salt, and if you don't replace it, you die. So actually, my ancestors probably used to call these people bloodthirsty savages. So Jeff and I came up with the term that because they were smart enough to find that source of salt for their diet, we call them bloodthirsty savants. But again, when a couple Brits back in the late 1920s went and lived among these people for a year and studied them and compared them to, so these people lived up in the hills. There were people down in the valleys along the river bottoms and along the lake shores who farmed. And those are the Kikuyu people. And it's interesting because people say, oh, you can eat a diet of meat and fat, but it doesn't properly nourish you and it's going to stunt your growth. These guys lived on just meat, milk, and blood, and they were on average 6 inches taller for the males and 3 inches taller than the females than the Kikuyu people who lived in the same region but lived as subsistence farmers. So the idea that, yeah, you could live in that diet but you can't thrive on it, these guys look kind of like they're pretty lean and pretty healthy. And that's what Orr and Gilkes found as well. And then in my own continent, North America, when my ancestors discovered that the place was already occupied, we came upon people who lived on the buffalo. These were people from the Osage Native American group. And these were paintings made by a skilled painter by the name of George Catlin, who was trained in painting and portrait artistry in Philadelphia. And for whatever reason, for 10 years, he went west of the Mississippi in the 1830s before the area had much white contact at all. And he painted these portraits of these two guys and many others. There are over 250 of his paintings still preserved in our Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. But the thing that stands out about these guys is compared to the size of their body, their heads are tiny. So if this guy was really good as a painter, how come their heads are so tiny? And the answer is they're between 6.5 and 7 feet tall. And they weren't unusual for the people who lived on the buffalo. And these are nomadic peoples. They did not farm in the summer, hunt buffalo in the winter. They followed the buffalo where they went year-round as nomads. And again, it was a point of pride for these males in particular that they ate no vegetable products at all. So the idea that this is a stunting diet or an unhealthy diet, there's something that these people knew that allowed them to achieve significant physical stature and health on a diet that to most classically trained nutritionists is imbalanced and dangerous. But maybe not, if we just knew what they ate. So luckily there was this guy, a Canadian-born gentleman named Stefansson. His first name is unpronounceable. His parents were Icelandic, and that's why it's unpronounceable. But my best rendition is Wilhelm was his first name. He called himself Willie. Stefansson. And he studied anthropology at Harvard, and then his research project was he wanted to study the Inuit people. So he went into the Arctic, just for a year, and ended up, for whatever reason, spending 10 years in the Arctic, living among the Inuit, learned their language. For periods, at one point, he was not seen in any trading post or outpost for 2 years. His obituary was published in the New York Times. And then he came back and said, hey, yeah, I've got some really interesting observations. And I found some islands that nobody's ever found before. And so he came back and he wrote in a number of books as well as scientific papers describing his life among the Inuit and what they ate. And he said that they ate just meat and fat, and most of what they ate was fat. They didn't eat that much meat, and they ate little, if any, foods of plant origin. Of course, he came back in, I think, 1917, and between 1914 and 1928, all of the 12 vitamins that we now know as vitamins that people need to have to maintain health, those were all biochemically characterized, discovered. And some of them are found only in plant foods, like vitamin C. And so he said, I could live on a diet, I'd live for 2 years straight without any, agricultural foods of any kind. And he was so abused in the literature, they call him a liar. His colleagues called him a liar. That in order to salvage his reputation, he allowed himself to be locked up in a research hospital in New York City, and to prove that he could stay alive and healthy on a diet of meat and fat. The hypothesis was of the scientists who were overseeing the study was that he was going to develop scurvy, and which is vitamin C deficiency, which means you get loose teeth, you get little bleeding spots on your skin, you get swollen joints, and if you don't eat some fruits that have vitamin C in them, like oranges, lemons, and limes, then you will die. And so they were subjecting him to something they thought was going to make him sick and potentially kill him. And he went for a whole year on a diet of meat and fat and remained completely healthy. So they published a paper about this, in a really good journal, the Journal of Biological Chemistry, we just call it JBC for short, in 1930. And they started out the papers, the summary, or the abstract at the start of it, they said, the Stefansson experiment failed. He remained healthy. Ethically, we would not be allowed to do that these days. Luckily, he ate what he had been taught by the Inuit to eat. And the doctors McClellan and Dubois, who oversaw this project, quantitated precisely what he ate. And so we actually have something, it's indirect, but I think a pretty good measure of what these people who lived in the Arctic chose to eat. And he ate about 115 grams of protein per day, which for a guy his height, he was 5'8", represents between 15 and 20% of his daily energy expenditure. His only carbohydrate came from whatever little bits of stored blood sugar in the form of glycogen was in the muscle of the animals that he ate. And we estimate that was less than 2% of his calories, or about 10 grams of carbs per day. And everything else came from fat. So we say greater than 80% from fat. I mean, this is horrifying. I mean, I told somebody yesterday I was sitting next to that, yeah, I eat 75 to 80% of my calories is fat. And the person goes, it's like, are you going to die momentarily? But I mean, I eat what he ate. And again, we don't, it's not just meat, it's lean stuff, it's organ meats as well. So brains, marrow, liver, kidney, all of these are back on the table. As long as the animals are raised in a reasonably hygienic environment and without pesticides and chemicals and stuff. So now we have a measure roughly of what these people ate, at least from one source. So when you restrict protein to a moderate level and you eat very little carbohydrate, what your body does is it turns some of the fat that you either eat or you have stored into these chemicals called ketones. Now, ketones have a really bad name among doctors and dietitians and nutritionists, because what we're taught about ketones in school is that when ketones get really high, you develop something called ketoacidosis. And if you don't treat this really aggressively in the emergency department in a hospital, you can die of it. But ketoacidosis only occurs in what we used to call juvenile onset or type 1 diabetes, the diabetes that typically kids get. And that's a form of diabetes where your body can't make insulin. And if you have no insulin, then you go into ketoacidosis. If your body can make even a little bit of insulin, you won't go into ketoacidosis. So type 2 diabetics, the adult onset kind, doesn't go into ketoacidosis. If you eat protein in moderation and you keep carbs really low, and it doesn't have to be 10 grams, most people can go as high as 50 grams of carbs per day, your ketones will run somewhere between 1 and 3 millimolar. Or what would that be? 3 green puffs, Rod? Up to, this would be 3 green down here, or 4 green down here, and this might be red up here. So in this range, we call this nutritional ketosis. It begins at about 0.5 millimolar. If you had toast and jam and orange juice for breakfast, and you had, say, some kind of sandwich for lunch, your value would be down here at 0.1 or 0.2. So this level down here is where people eat a lot of carbohydrates. So we didn't put this on the slide here because it's kind of pejorative, but we call this zone down here the garbage zone. This is where the carbohydrates in your body suppress your ability to utilize fat sufficiently for fuel. So this is the nutritional ketosis range. This is safe. There's no harm here. And this is where the ketones act as a very sustaining fuel for your body, and your body can use them just equally as well as it can use blood sugar. So if we take away the carbs over the course of a few weeks, remember Swatka said 2 to 3 weeks until one can do severe fatiguing journeys. Once you get into that adapted state, this becomes your source of fuel. And unlike carbohydrate, where you have very little of it stored in your body, so you got to eat it 2 or 3 times a day, or if you're out running a marathon, you got to eat carbohydrate at every aid station to get you to the finish line. This you make out of body fat or dietary fat. And I'm not particularly heavy, but I've got 50 to 60,000 calories of fat in my body. And all of that is available to me as a source of fuel. Whereas if I ate a whole lot of carbohydrate and filled my body as full as I could of carbohydrate, I'd only put in about 2,000 calories. So little fuel tank, 2,000 maximum. Even a thin person, big tank, 30, 40, 50,000 calories of fuel. So if you want to be sustained with energy, this is a more sustaining, larger supply that one can have. And the other point is you want to lose weight, being able to turn the stuff that you have stored that you don't want to have that much of, again, this is a way to use it efficiently without being driven by the constant need to eat carbs and refuel over and over again. So if we look at diets that people advocate or that people choose to eat, whatever, we can sort of define a range here. And unfortunately, I see this got kind of distorted when we transposed the slide from one PowerPoint program to another. But this one up here, this is the Ornish diet. I don't know if you've heard of the Ornish diet, but Dean Ornish in the United States is an advocate of eating a vegan diet, very high in plant foods, essentially almost totally of plant foods. And it's typically 70% carbs, 10% protein, and less than 20% of calories is fat. So it's a very low fat, very high complex carbohydrate diet. The SAD here should be SAD in Rogan. This is, from my continent, we call it the standard American diet, but you can call it the standard Australian diet if you want. We're all very similar. This is typically about 50% carbs, 10 to 15% of calories is protein, and 30% of 35% of calories is fat. So still pretty low in fat. This is very low in fat. The Mediterranean is in the range, diets in the range of 40% of calories is fat. And all those are considered diets that are relatively high in carbohydrate. You only get to low carbohydrate when you get under 30% of calories as fat. And the paleo diet we've heard so much about, including what your local football team is now following, tends to be in the range of 20 to 30% of calories as carbs, mostly from fruit and starchy vegetables, rather than from refined products. No grains allowed typically. But again, most advocates of paleo say you shouldn't go below 20% of calories as carbs. Why is that? Because this is not a ketogenic diet. And you don't have those ketones to feed your body. Particularly, you don't have the ketones to feed your brain. And your brain burns, this is surprising for many people, 600 calories a day. 3-pound little brain. 600 calories. For many people, that's a third of their daily energy expenditure, just burned by the brain. And if you don't have enough fuel to feed the brain, what happens? Lights go out. Kaboom. I once, I was teaching this to a bunch of medical students, and they were like, I'm getting sleepy, and so I just passed. I did a fake to pass. I didn't quite hit my head on the floor, but a couple of them rushed up and wanted to do CPR on me. I was just demonstrating what happens when you pass. Anyway. So to get into nutritional ketosis, as I mentioned, you really need to get down at or under 10% of calories as carbohydrate. You need to keep protein moderate, so 10 to 20%. Most paleo diets in the range of 30%. Now, I'm not throwing any stones at paleo because there are a lot of people who do really well on paleo. But if you have achieved or acquired problems such as diabetes or pre-diabetes or a lot of extra weight, this zone in here, this little space down here, this nutritional ketosis space, gives people a much more power to kind of resist the urge to eat, gives them much more sustained fuel supply. And that then becomes a tool for major weight loss or oftentimes for complete reversal of type 2 diabetes if people get this dialed in just right. Now, is that all you need to know about a low-carb diet? Well, the answer is no, because the things we didn't learn from the Inuit is how do you get enough minerals on this diet? Where do you get your calcium? What are the other components that you need? Because a diet is made up of a whole bunch of things, including vitamins. And which of the vitamins do we really need, and which of the ones don't we don't need? Stefansson pretty much proved you, at least for a year, you don't need vitamin C. And that's complete heresy, by the way. But I can actually explain why that happens. But it's still, like I say, in that sense, like it is in so many others, I'm still considered a heretic, so I won't burden you with that. So one of the things I want to discuss tonight, and the problem that many people have is when they start out on a low-carb diet, a low-carb ketogenic diet, and let's say you have a person, an average height woman who weighs 200 pounds, and this is going to sound shocking, but typically a woman in the middle years of life weighing 200 pounds, which would be about 90 kilos, will burn about 2,800 calories a day. If she eats 1,400 calories a day, and when we tell people, go ahead and eat as much as you want, just don't eat the carbs, they frequently just eat 1,400 calories a day. And they'll lose up to a kilo or more per week of body fat. And so if you look here at where the energy for that person comes from, if this pie-shaped circle here is 2,800 calories per day, about 5% comes from carbs, 20% from protein coming from the outside, 25% comes from dietary fat. But to lose over a kilo of body fat per week, half of your fuel is coming from inside. So the purple here is body fat, the donation of body fat. This is dietary fat. And that's how weight loss occurs, because you eat less than you burn. Now, some people say, but Steve, are you saying that calories in equals calories out? It's much more complex than you know, that issue, because it's not just how many calories come in, it's how many calories you feel compelled to eat, which determines what comes in. And getting into nutritional ketosis gives people permission to burn quite a bit of their body fat stores. As the person loses weight, if they go from 200 to 180, a couple things happen. One is their daily energy need comes down because they're carrying, you know, that's 10 kilos less of excess weight. So their metabolic requirement comes down, and naturally as people lose and get a little bit slimmer, their internal signals say eat a little bit more. So they'll go from 14 maybe to 1,800 calories per day. We try to keep carb intake really low, down. As long as people want to lose weight, they really should stay at or under 50, 55 grams of carbs per day. And as the weight loss progresses, further reduction in energy requirement per day, tendency to eat a little bit more. People increase the range of foods that they eat. And to get to maintenance, let's say a person loses 50 pounds, which would be about 22 kilos, they get down to the point where their daily energy intake or expenditure is 2,200, and if they're holding weight stable, then their intake is 2,200. And notice here now, and this is where it gets those shocking numbers. Notice there's no purple because they're not losing weight. There's no net change in terms of body fat content. So in order to stay here and stay at that 55 gram carb intake, they have to eat 70% of their calories as fat. So if you want to use this strategy for long-term maintenance to hold severe obesity, strong propensity for diabetes, that's what we call pre-diabetes or metabolic syndrome, or if you have type 2 diabetes and you get it in remission, if you want to keep this off long-term, you have to make your peace with the fact that most of your calories for long-term future is going to have to come from fat. And if that sounds scary to you, I hope by the time you get to this point, you can become at ease with this, because that's going to be the necessity for most people. Now, if you start out being, healthy and pretty slim to begin with, you may be able to, go in the paleo zone here. You do this on a paleo, say 50% here and 30% there and 20% here. That'll work for some people. So we adjust the caloric maintenance intake to the metabolic tolerances of each individual. There's no cookie cutter approach. So I just want to give you a sense that there's a progression, that what you start with here eating isn't going to work here, that you're going to have to change this over time as you go from burning lots of body fat to the point where you're no longer burning body fat and you're in maintenance. And if you just can kind of get your head around that, I think we'll have made a huge success here, because when I look at many of the low-carb diet strategies that are out there, there's a book called the Dukan diet that came from France, and it was a big seller in the United States. And I read the book, and it tells you all about how to lose weight. But when you read, he talks about maintenance, but he never really tells people that this is what you're going to do in maintenance. And to be honest, I'm a co-author on the most recent rendition of the Atkins book called The New Atkins for a New You. And Bob Atkins was a pioneer back in the 1970s up to his unfortunate death from a head injury in 2003. But he never really clearly outlined the strategy. And we think that when we get this in place, this will no longer be a diet that someone goes on just for a few months to drop by 4 dress sizes or something like that. This is can become a long-term lasting lifestyle. And it can be healthy, and it doesn't represent long-term risk. In fact, it represents major long-term reduction in risk if you're coming into it with prediabetes, diabetes, hypertension, and other diseases that are associated with what we call insulin resistance. So another key aspect here, we're saying, okay, in long-term maintenance, you've got to eat the majority of your dietary calories from fat. But all fats aren't just created equal. And there are some fats that should be on your table, literally, and some that are taken off the table, literally. And the ones that are taken off the table are ones that many dietitians will tell you, in good faith, because that's what they were taught, are the healthy fats. And those are the high polyunsaturated seed oils. And people say, well, this is a good fat for you because the polyunsaturates are essential. That's true. And they don't contain cholesterol. That's true. Because if you eat lard, down here, see this big, and by the way, this diagram was created by someone who had a negative view of saturated fat because the saturated fats are red. You're like, stop, red. So, but what it doesn't show you here, but the animal fats like lard and beef tallow and butter fat, they contain cholesterol. And people say, oh, that's dangerous, you shouldn't eat those. Whereas the ones like safflower and sunflower and corn and soybean and peanut oil and cottonseed, they have all this great essential fat, the blue stuff here, and no cholesterol, so they must be good for you. So there is a, this is a terrible pun when I talk about seed oils, but there is a grain of truth to that. And that is that we do need some of this blue stuff. We need a little bit of it every day. But the amount we need is less than a teaspoon a day. So I eat 200 grams of fat a day. A teaspoon is 5 grams. So what is that? That's 2% of my daily fat intake. I only need 2% of this stuff. Which one? Well, here's 2. Well, beef. That's 3%. So I could live on beef tallow and get enough omega-6 fat. I wouldn't get enough omega-3 fat because, see, it's only 1%, and I want to get about 2%. So the omega-3s, this is what we call, people call fish oil, but it's also found in vegetable. Canola has some, soybean has some. We don't have flaxseed oil in here. Flaxseed oil is 50% omega-3. But you only need a couple percent of your intake from omega-3 and omega-6. You don't need 50%. And when we try to feed people who are on a high-fat diet, corn or soybean oil, and I actually did this myself in a really gross experiment once, and I won't bore you with those details, but I made myself sick trying to eat enough of this when I was on a ketogenic diet. Literally, I couldn't tolerate it. And when I switched to olive oil, see, olive oil is very high in monosaccharate and has just a, rather than the big blues here, it has just a little blue, right? On olive oil, I could eat 200 grams of that a day and have absolutely no problems. I've actually eaten 200 grams of butterfat per day, and I have no problem with that. Do I eat 200 grams of butterfat per day? No, I include butter in my diet, but I eat a range of fats. So you can have coconut oil. You can have olive oil. You can have butter. You can have lard. You can have beef tallow. You can have the fat in the chicken. You don't have to take off the skin anymore. If you want omega-3 fats, you can get enough by eating wild ocean fatty fish 2 or 3 times a week. And it doesn't have to be as an entree. You can have some smoked salmon in breakfast with, wrapped up in lettuce leaves with some cream cheese and some capers. So it's like kind of having lox and bagels, just no bagel. You got a lot of choices. But the things, if you're eating a high-fat diet, the things you need to stay away from are the things with a lot of blue here. Because when people try to do that, then they come back to me and they say, I tried that diet. It worked well at the start, but when I got to the point where I was getting to weight stability, I just couldn't eat all that fat. It just made me sick. So your diet is really, ineffective. And what they were trying to eat is, the quote, healthy fats. And one of the biggest problems in the States, a popular way of eating fat is to eat mayonnaise. I don't know how popular is mayonnaise, and you're down under. Yeah. Almost every brand of mayonnaise we have in the States is made with soybean oil. You can sometimes find canola oil, and I'm not a big fan of canola oil, but if you're going to buy mayonnaise and you're going to eat mayonnaise, you're far better off eating canola oil mayonnaise than you are soybean oil mayonnaise. You can sometimes find other specialty brands. The best thing to do is learn how to make it yourself. It's not that hard to do. from just egg yolks and oil and a little bit of lemon juice and a few pinches of spices. You know, if you make that with olive oil, then you've got a really nice, and you know, I make it up in a batch and keep it in the fridge for a week, and you know, usually my family you know, cleans me out before I'm ready to be cleaned out and have to go make some more. So again, getting the type of fat right is really important if you want to make this a sustainable lifestyle. Now I've been told, okay, great, Steve, you know, you're a doctor, you're a high income guy, you can buy the olive oil, yeah, but we can't. Well, I buy my olive oil at my local warehouse store. I'm told that you guys have been invaded by Costco down here now. So, well, you know, we've been conquered by Costco. But I go to my local Costco and I can get 2 3-liter jugs with a kind of strap holding them together. And that cost me $23 US. If you do the math on that, per 1,000 calories, that costs 57 cents a 1,000 calories. I burn 2,800 calories a day. So I get more than 1/3 of my energy per day if I take it as olive oil for 57 cents. That's not expensive. Now, I know people who say they can't afford it, and then they go to the local coffee shop and get a long black with cream, and it's like $2.95 or something. Yeah, question?
Steve, I read an email today that came out of the States about the how in America they bring in a lot of those bulk olive oils that have been bastardized. They've done a lot of testing on it, and it's not pure olive oil. They're putting sunflower oil, and when they're bringing it in from the EU, because olive oil is expensive, so they're putting other items in it, so it's not actually pure. It's actually probably worse for you than if you were having some of the other olive oils.
A lot of brands of olive oil are heavily adulterated with other sources of oil. In fact, in Italy, some market economists did a study in Italy, and they looked at how much olive oil is produced in Italy. They looked at how much olive oil is imported into Italy as olive oil, and then they looked at how many gallons of olive oil were exported from Italy as olive oil, and the sum of the internal production and the import is less than the amount of olive oil that gets shipped out of Italy every year, which means the Italians are mixing in other stuff as well. So you need
made in Italy. They're calling it grown, made from.
Yeah, they call it. Many of them they say made in Italy. My Costco oil, and I trust Costco. Why? Because my friend Doug Bibas in Minnesota, who runs fatty acid analysis for us, I sent him multiple samples of it, and you can tell if it's olive oil because it's 77% plus or minus a few percent of oleic acid, monounsaturated. And if you see the blue bigger than 8%, so safflower, sunflower, you look at anything else here, how can you mimic olive oil with any of these? You can't. If you put something else in, you change the fatty acid composition and it can be checked. So when I buy my jugs, and I look at it, it says packed in Italy, sourced from Italy, Greece, Tunisia, Spain, Portugal, wherever. And so they honestly say, this wasn't all grown in Italy, but it was packed in Italy. And when we analyzed it, I don't do it every week because it costs $100 to send my friend a sample. It's my friend, but he's not that good a friend. But I've come to trust the brand.
So what brand is it in Costco?
It's their house brand. They call that Kirkland.
Oh yeah.
So they. I'm not trying to sell you Costco, but a lot of the stuff they sell is really toxic. The candy aisle is just. But anyway.
But we have beautiful olive oil at the farmers markets here.
Have olives come to Australia? Are you growing olives here?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Hey, no, get your local stuff. Buy it from the people you know and trust.
Sorry, Steve. Rice bran oil is pretty popular in because of the high smoke point. Do you know where it sits on the spectrum with regard to saturated fat and non-saturated fat?
Rice bran oil?
Yeah, it's very popular.
Yeah, I did a project for the California Rice Board back in 1989, and I'm getting old, and as I recall, it was not dissimilar to cottonseed oil, but maybe more like 35 or 40% blue. So better than most of these. But eat a variety of things. And, eat, particularly if you can get it, grass-fed or natural, or naturally pastured poultry, wild fish. I don't sit down and eat 200 calories of fat a day, but I incorporate, butter, olive oil, coconut oil in my diet and cooking. I make dressings for which I use olive oil as my primary source. One of the things that I like and my kids liked a lot, of course they've gone to college, so I can't, have the fun of feeding them anymore and experimenting on them, but I made a mixture of butter and olive oil, so 50-50 butter and olive oil. And you put that in the fridge, so it's soft at room temperature. You put it in the fridge just like a soft tub margarine, but it melts nicely and quickly on top of a warm piece of meat. When you put it on your plate, you put some of this half butter, half olive oil on top of it, or on vegetables or on fish. And it's just very easy to eat. And the other thing you can do with that, you can put a little garlic and a little fresh basil and fresh oregano in the blender when you blend it up, and that gives it kind of an Italian herb flavor to it. And so it's an herb butter mix. And it's economical and easy to eat. So again, the strategy to get to maintenance with this is finding sources of fat that are A, healthy for you, B, you can afford, and C, that you enjoy eating. And the neat thing about when you get the fat combination right, the people who taste and the people who study taste and human behavior around food say you've got to have low taste extinction. You probably had things that you had it once, it tasted great. You had it the third time, it was okay. The fifth time, you don't want to have it again for a month or 2 months. You have to find the fat mix that you can eat it day in and day out for years, and you'll be fine. Now, my friend and co-author Jeff Volek, he was a state champion power lifter when he was actually in his adult years, and he was big into meat in those days. He was low carb, but he was more in the paleo, 30-35% of calories as fat, and I'm sorry, 30-35% of calories as protein. And so he said, I really enjoy steak. He said, for dinner sometimes I'll have 2. And he said, and I said, isn't there a problem with that? He says, have you ever met anybody who's allergic to steak? But since we're working together in research, and I didn't do it on purpose, but I got him to the point where he now enjoys having an 8 to 10 ounce steak with 2 or 3 tablespoons of butter on top, rather than having 2 steaks. It's just as satisfying, costs a lot less, and spreads the protein around to other people who want to eat it. Anyway, should move on here. So the other thing people tell me is, that's great, but you're eating the same thing all the time, just meat and fish and meat. And actually, one can have a highly varied diet with this. And in the book, we actually have a 7-day array of sample menus like this. But I just point out that you can have things that are quick. I can put 4 sausages in the microwave, make myself a cup of instant coffee, and I can be done with, cook my breakfast and be done with it in 5 minutes out of the kitchen. And if it's good quality sausages, not these fake things, the fake low-fat things, I'm satisfied with that till lunchtime. I can have my breakfast at 6 and have my lunch at 12:30 and not be bothered at all, and it can be very quick. Lunch can be made very easily as a salad you can put in either meat or tuna, put a nice dressing on it that contains plenty of fat, because you want to get the fat for the satiety. You can have snacks during the day that can be anything from nuts, broth, soft cheese with crisp vegetables if you want, or if you don't want to have snacks, just don't have them. But if you find at 3 in the afternoon you're hungry, and you have a snack available to you, you have the right food, then you've satisfied that hunger. If you don't have it with you and there's somebody down the hall who's got a box of donuts, you're far better off having this available and eating it than going and eating some garbage. And then things that one can have, I make soups, homemade soups using homemade broth. And we'll come back to broth a little bit in about 2 more slides. We're getting to the end here. But I make tomato bisque with fresh cream and homegrown heirloom tomatoes. And tomatoes have quite a bit of carbs in them. But if I make a cream tomato bisque, my cup of tomato bisque contains 2 ounces of actual tomato. And I get about 4 ounces per day of berry fruit, so I can have raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, olives, tomatoes, totaling 4 ounces per day. So that's half my, and I get this really luscious soup. I got to have some steak, I have buttered green beans, mushrooms, and you can actually, you have to make it homemade, at least in the States. We can't get any ice cream that's truly low carb that is worth eating. But you can make your own very easily. I make it in batches of translate, a liter at a time. But my typical dose is about 120 cc's. So I get 8 servings. I make a batch of it, say on a Saturday, put it in containers, put it in my freezer. And if I get fat hunger, and by the way, you will learn that there is something called fat hunger. So if I go for a 40-mile bike ride yesterday, this evening, I'd have fat hunger. And I recognize it. And so I need to have something around which is pretty much just fat. You can use sucralose. We're not absolutely against using artificial sweeteners. I'm not a big fan of them. I don't like the taste of them. So my choice is to use a naturally occurring, it's quite expensive sugar called xylitol. I get it about $4 a pound if I buy it in bulk. But I only use a few teaspoons of it per serving to make this. And xylitol has no effect on insulin, no blockage of my ability to burn fat. So there are things that you acquire these skills over time, or you find other people who have those skills and you cajole them to make it for you. But one way or another, you can have a highly varied diet that's rich in fat, low enough in carbohydrates that it gives you access to fat for fuel. Yeah?
What about stevia?
Stevia is a naturally occurring sweetener from the leaf of a plant. That's a true natural compound. Many people swear by it and love it. And it's your choice what you use. People say, well, sucralose. That's Splenda. You say, well, that's an artificial chemical. Well, if I had the choice between having something with Splenda in it or having something that had 5 teaspoons of sugar in it, table sugar, which is more toxic to me?
No sugar.
And it would be sugar. This was, who wrote the book Sweet, White, and Deadly? Or White, Sweet, and Deadly? It was, yeah. It's true now as it was back in 1975 when he wrote it. Let me finish up a couple more slides here, and then we'll open it up. So what I want people to think about, and what I'd like to discuss and answer questions about, is how do you make this into a sustainable lifestyle? Anybody can follow any diet for a month, well, almost any, or even 2 months or 3 months, but it's only going to benefit you if it gives you lasting control and empowers you to keep whether it's weight or high blood pressure or diabetes at bay. And so I don't want to try to make this too simple. And my wife, if you were here, says he never makes it too simple. First is it's not high protein, it's moderate protein. Once you get to maintenance, it has to have enough energy, because if you don't feed your body, it's going to make you feed it. Anyway, so most of that energy needs to come from fat, and you have to have no fear of saturated fat. And again, the whole thing of why saturated fats aren't bad for you is we're finally making progress on that, but the scientific data is absolutely solid. But like your 2 countrymen in Perth, Drs. Ward and Marshall, who back in 1985 had proven that stomach ulcers are caused not by acid, but by a lowly bacterium that you could wipe out in a week with antibiotics. And in 1985, they'd proven that definitively. One of them actually infected himself by drinking the bacteria, got acute gastritis, cured it, and then he looked down with an endoscope and said, look, it's bright red, it's inflamed, wow. And then he took the antibiotics and it went away. It was 1995 when we in the United States adopted antibiotic treatment of ulcers. Once you publish but in the meantime, people who had bleeding ulcers, if we couldn't get their bleeding stopped by within 4 units of transfusion, and I was practicing medicine back then before I quit, before I became a recovering academic physician. But if we had given them 4 units of blood, and we hadn't stopped their bleeding, we'd send them to the operating room, they'd open them up, cut it out, stitch it back together. You end up with less stomach. I mean, how many times do you do that before you end up with people who have crippled gastrointestinal function? And you could cure it with just a combination of 2 antibiotics. I mean, it sounds horrible, but physicians, the medical establishment does not change overnight. And this is not the only time when it's taken 10 years for the obvious to be accepted. So we now have, I'm coming back to saturated fat. I didn't lose the train of thought. We now have incontrovertible evidence that saturated fat's not bad for you. So you don't have to fear them. Getting the right kind, staying away from the blues is important. And that means you can have saturates, but we really need to focus on monounsaturates. And then probably one of the biggest struggles that we currently have is the issue of mineral management, particularly as it pertains to salt and sodium. So a person who would eat the diet that I showed you a couple slides back, if they reasonably lightly salted their food, they'd eat about 3 grams of sodium a day. Now, in my country, in the United States, the typical American eats between 5 and 7 grams of sodium a day. So 3 is not a high salt intake. My government wants us all to cut our sodium down to 2.3 grams per day because a very small fraction of the population, if they eat 3 grams per day, their blood pressure will go up slightly. And they connect the dots and say, well, if your blood pressure goes up slightly, and we have 300 million people, we might kill a few thousand people a year because of complications of high blood pressure. So we're going to put the whole country on 2.3 grams of sodium a day. But when you're in nutritional ketosis, that triggers your kidneys to accelerate salt excretion. So you've just moved to a different planet, the planet of ketosis, keto land, we call it. And if you eat even just 3 grams of sodium a day, then you will have lightheadedness, dizziness, fatigue, and to some degree, sometimes constipation. People sometimes jokingly call that the Atkins flu, because so many people who started out on the Atkins diet had that problem, because Bob Atkins never talked about salt, the need for salt. And probably because he was smart enough to know that he was, it was going to make him even less popular than he already was. But if you have even 3 grams of sodium a day, you're going to have these flu symptoms. So what we found is if we add 2 grams more of sodium to that, if your carbs are under 50, which means you're in ketosis, generally speaking, so that takes you up to 5 grams of sodium a day. You won't have fatigue, lightheadedness, dizziness. If you go out and decide to do something vigorous in terms of exercise, you won't quit after 15 minutes because you figure you just run out of energy. You didn't run out of energy. Your circulation can't function if you don't have enough salt, because blood is what contains salt. Not enough salt, not enough blood, can't circulate enough to exercise and keep your brain fully supplied. So if I'm beating on this, it's because it's very important. If you don't have enough salt in your system, then your body wastes potassium. If you don't have enough potassium, you can have heart rhythm problems. And when, in an extreme case of this, back in the late 1970s in the United States, there was a popular book called The Last Chance Diet, written by a doctor who didn't know diddly squat about nutrition or minerals. And people went on, this is an extremely low salt, low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. And we know of at least 50 cases of people who had no prior heart disease who died sudden death because of abnormal heart rhythm, because they were deprived of sodium during ketosis and they lost potassium, and that caused their heart to go into fatal rhythms. It's important. So how do you manage this? You add a little bit more sodium in the form of broth or bouillon. Don't shake a lot more in your food. Just have a cup of homemade broth twice a day. The other alternative is, I have a little baggie somewhere here. That was the one that contained got a lot of pockets. That was the other one. So I'm running out of them. These are my little bouillon cubes. People say, oh, those are full of chemicals. But these are little, bouillon or broth cubes that you can buy. And each one of these that I carry around with me for my own use contains 1 gram of sodium. So when I'm at home, typically I have my own homemade broth. And the recipes for that are in the book. But when I'm traveling, as I said jokingly, when I came in here today, I don't have any broth with me because they wouldn't let me bring it in when I came into Australia. You have any meat products? Oh no, I just have broth made from meat. Yeah. So I carry these, and that's kind of my crutch when I'm away from home. And 2 of them per day keeps me upright, and I can stand here and talk and get animated and not get lightheaded and pass out, actually in front of you. So is that safe to do? 3 grams in the food, 2 in the broth. Sounds like a lot of sodium. My government says 2.3. So luckily, we in the United States live next to a group of very smart people called Canadians. They put up with us, and they do some really, really good science. So this is a group from McMaster University in Quebec. I'm sorry, in Ontario, yeah. Quebec isn't part of Canada. And so these people did a study where because in the past, when my government said, well, let's have everybody eat 2.7 grams of sodium, that was based, among other things, on information of what people said they ate. So you say, how much food did you eat this day? What did you eat? Write it all down. And they calculate it out and it says 2.7 grams of sodium. But people don't always tell the truth when you're asking them about things that they're not supposed to be eating. So these people went to 17 countries, collected urine samples from 102,000 people, where the urine samples actually contained, indicated how much sodium they'd actually eaten in the previous day. Okay? And then they followed them for 3.7 years and looked at how many of those people lived or died. And what they found was that this thing called odds ratio, 1.0, that's where the death rate is lowest. And where did that occur? It occurred at 5 grams per day, not 2.7. If you go to 2.7 with their data, if everybody in the United States ate 2.7, we'd increase the mortality rate by about 60%. Based on this data. This is the first truly objective data for urine excretion of sodium, not diet, not food record guesses for sodium intake. And by the way, there's other data that was similar to this, but it was discounted because it was a small study or only one country or stuff. So they did 17 countries, 102,000 people. I mean, this is a massive study. That tells you that between 5 and really almost out to 8, there's very little increase in the mortality risk in that range. So man, I'm telling you all kinds of really dangerous and heretical stuff here. You could have saturated fat. You don't have to eat carbohydrates. You don't have to eat all that garbage, and salt isn't bad for you. Yeah.
Why is it being excreted if the body needs it?
Because there's a constant flow of fluid through the body. So if you drink 2 quarts of water a day, and you have to either sweat it or excrete it, and stuff comes out with it, and so it's what we call turnover. But it's actually a good question. I mean, if their kidneys are really smart, we'd only need 500 milligrams of sodium a day, which is probably what we lose in our sweat in an average day. And the kidneys aren't perfect. And if you hang on to sodium really, really aggressively, then the kidney is going to excrete potassium. And potassium is required to build and maintain muscle and maintain normal nerve function. And if you get low in potassium, you have muscle problems and heart rhythm problems. So, we've only had 1 billion years to work on these details. And maybe in another 1 billion years, we'll get this more refined. I mean, I don't want to be too facetious, but it was a good question. But physiologically, where we as humans are, we have to have salt.
So what's the note mean on the slide?
The
note.
The note? If you're in ketosis, as I said, that accelerates salt excretion. And that means that this area down here, where it starts to rise, that probably moves this direction. But we don't know, because in this population of 102,000 people, they probably had almost no one who was in nutritional ketosis. We're a rare group. We might represent 1% of the population in the developed world right now. I hope we're getting that high. So that's what the note means. If anything, if the nutritional ketosis is going to shift the safety zone in any direction, it's going to shift it to your right, which means the risk of having too much salt is very low. Unless you eat a kilogram of sauerkraut and you don't rinse it before you cook it or something. I don't know, but it's possible for people to. There's places in Japan where in seafaring villages in Japan where they eat 15 to 20 grams of sodium a day, because they have salted fish and they put soy sauce and everything. But for most of us who aren't in that sort of diet, have that sort of dietary practice, we're in this range here. And so this is not dangerous. This is dangerous. And if you don't eat the salt, you're going to have the symptoms. And if you ignore the symptoms, you're going to have problems. So just preventive maintenance on this is important. So I probably shouldn't get too much into this, but I'll just mention that in my clinical experience over many years, a lot of people who have type 2 diabetes have muscle cramps. Some people who don't have type 2 diabetes have muscle cramps. And it turns out that a common cause of that, not the only cause of muscle cramps, is a deficiency in magnesium. And that if one has muscle cramps or develops them when they're on the diet, if one takes a moderate dose of magnesium, those can be resolved pretty effectively. The problem we have is that my favorite preparation, which works best when I work with patients, isn't available in Australia. So I've kind of got my hands tied. But maybe, maybe in a year or so, Rod and I will figure out a way to get this better form. It's not expensive, imported and make it available. So we'll come back to that in the question and answer period if people have that. So not to make too sharp a point of it, but if you're wondering, is my diet okay? Should I change it? When in doubt, eat less carbs. There is no dose of carbohydrate that is necessary, dietary carbohydrate is necessary for human health if you have the meat and fat mixture right and you have enough minerals and vitamins in it. When in doubt, eat more fat. And then the other thing you have to, if you want to make this sustainable, something that you can live with for years and decades, is it has to be pleasurable. It has to give you satiety, taste, variety, and you have to get to the point where you don't feel guilty eating it. If you go in the restaurant and they serve you your meal and you take the butter and put it on top of your meat and you just don't let anybody see it, and you do it in the open. You can put extra dressing on. You can ask for extra, butter. People come to my table and say, would you like some bread? And they start to put it down and say, I don't need the bread. And they start to pick it up. I said, but I'll take the butter. Do that. Do it in the open. Don't be guilty. Because if you don't eat enough calories, you're going to have cravings, you're going to be hungry, and you're going to break the diet. So find a satiety, pleasure, variety, and it's sustainable. So I used to live in Minnesota. I said, come visit me. We'll put you up in my bed and breakfast, and you don't need air conditioning. Thank you, and let's kind of open it up for questions.